There we are. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Nellie Oliensis. I'm chair of the Berkeley Department of Classics, and I'm delighted to welcome you back for the third lecture in this year's Remote Sather series. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention the previous two lectures can be watched or rewatched on the Berkeley Classics YouTube channel. And in fact, we're getting very high tech. All the lectures are going to be up there along with a lot of other Sather lectures of the past. So that is something that you can do if you like. Also, the handout for this lecture, which you will definitely want to have if you don't already have it, is about to be made available, or maybe already is in the chat. There's a link to the handout, so you're going to want that. And one last detail before I become more formal. For this lecture, Professor Bettini is happy to take some questions afterwards, and we are going to use the Q&A function this time. We're trying many different things, and one of these days we'll sort out what's best. So that's just a heads up about some details. So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome the 104th Sather Professor of Classics back to Berkeley virtually, Maurizio Bettini, Professor Emeritus of Classical Philology and Director of the Center for Anthropology and the Ancient World at the University of Siena. Professor Bettini is a scholar of unsurpassed originality and fertility. And one of the things I appreciate most in his work is that it always surprises me. It is always opening up new topics and new ways of approaching old ones. Roman religion, ideas about language and translation, about time and space, about blood, birth, and cultural roots, the mythology of twins and the theme of the double. This is just a small sampling of the topics explored in his more than 25 solo authored books. And I'm talking here only about his scholarship because actually he is also a highly regarded and prize-winning novelist. Though I put the word Roman at the head of that list, that is actually an inaccurate restriction, since one of the pleasures of reading Maurizio Bettini's work is that it moves so easily, gracefully, illuminatingly, and authoritatively across divergent traditions, times, and spaces. So let me not delay our pleasure any longer. Today's lecture is entitled Defying Grammar, Linguistic Privileges for the Gods. And without further ado, I turn over the little screen to Maurizio Bettini.
Hello, can you see me? Hello, everybody. Before I begin, let me express my gratitude to Nellie Oliensis and the whole Department of Classics of UC Berkeley for inviting me to give this lecture, and above all, for taking me back to Berkeley. Berkeley, I am so happy to be here with you, here or there. I don't know how to say because it's so confusing, this virtual presence. But Berkeley is one of the places in my heart. I have so many dear memories of Berkeley. In Berkeley, I have so many dear colleagues and dear friends. And tonight for me and this morning for you, this lecture offers to me the illusion of being in Duinel or some other building on campus. And I assure you, for me, it's a very refreshing and pleasant sensation, especially in those difficult times we are living. So let's begin. Horace was an inconsistent character, as he claimed to be. In Satire 7 of the second book, he depicts himself being scolded for this at length by his slave Davus, who is allowed to take this liberty during the festival of the Saturnalia, the freedom of December. Introducing his monologue as an example, Davus cites the behavior of a certain Priscus, a character who lived inconsistently. This is going to be the point 1 in the handout I hope you have received or you have under your eyes anyways. It won't be indispensable, the handout, but to have it probably will be better. So I'm quoting Horace now. Thus, Priscus, who was often marked by wearing 3 rings, but once in a while by wearing none, was so fickle in his life that he would change his stripe every hour. Passing from a stately mansion, he would bury himself in a den from which a decent freedman could scarcely emerge without shame. Now he would choose to live in Rome as an adulterer, as a Magus, now as a sage, as a doctus in Athens. A man born when all the possible virtumni were hostile. Virtumnis quodquod sunt natus iniquis. Now, from Propertius in Primis, Tibullus, and numerous Latin authors, we know about the existence of a god, Virtumnus, to whom, by the way, some years ago, I dedicated a seminar in Berkeley. But anyways, but we know about one singular Virtumnus, not about many plural Virtumni, and even quodquod sunt in an unpredictable number. Isn't what they would say strange? According to Arnobius, grammar teachers would have rapped Horace's knuckles for this plural usage, virtumni. Divine names do not admit the plural number, or so it was taught. This is point 2. We have been traditionally, I'm quoting Arnobius now, we have been traditionally taught by our teachers that there is no plural in the declension of the names of gods, because the gods are singular, and because it is impossible that ownership of a proper name can be distributed among multiple subjects. You, however, you the Gentiles, however, have forgotten this and then have abandoned the memory of your elementary education. Arnobius remembered his lessons. The corpus of Latin grammarians explicitly records the rule to which he refers in point 3. The proper names of gods, elements, heroes, rivers, mountains decline only in the singular. What should we make then, Arnobius continues, of the 3 different Jupiters, the 5 Mercuries, 5 Minervas, and so on, of which your theologians speak? The religion you profess is so absurd that it does not even respect the rules of grammar. In this case, however, we are not so much interested in Arnobius's critique of the gods of polytheism as in the problem that he highlights indirectly. Did the language of the Romans disallow the plural of divine names? And if so, then what must we make of the virtumni, plural, who attended the birth of Priscus? To refute the ancient grammarians, it is actually sufficient to cite the various Ioves, Apollines, Mauartes in the plural, and so on, who appear scattered throughout Latin texts. Even if these are cases of plurals produced sometimes in the course of theological argumentation, as Arnobius, as we saw, and Varro, for example, or out of comic or metaphoric invention, as in Plautus, speaking of humani Ioves, or in reference to the different statues of a single god. In any case, our interest is not so much to prove the grammarians wrong, although there is some sort of anarchic pleasure in contradicting them, as to clarify in linguistic terms, as well as in anthropological, the field of divine plurals. In other words, let us enter the territory of linguistic representation of divinity in Roman culture. This is what interests me, the linguistic representation of divinity in Rome. Consider first that alongside the lar, this is point 4, alongside the lar, there were also the plural lares. Alongside Silvanus, there were also the Silvani. Alongside Faunus, there were also Fauni. Alongside Carmentis, there were also the Carmentes, and so on and so on. Paul Venn once has noted, quotation, it was not clearly understood whether there was only one Pan, Faunus, or Silenus, or many Pans, Fauni, and Sileni. The experience of the divine encounters a force, not an individuality. This is what Paul Venn remarked. The experience of the divine encounters a force, not an individuality. Naturally, in cases like this, we could observe that we are dealing with groups of minor divinities who were scarcely identifiable as individuals. But Roman culture had no problems in identifying also this as individuals. In Plautus's Aularia, for example, there is such an individual art that he recites the whole prologue from beginning to end, as well as a well-identified character on the stage. There are then all those cases of paired gods joined by strict family relations, designated by a single name in the plural, which blends their reciprocal individuality into one. So in point 5, you have, for example, castores, to indicate both Castor and Pollux, Cereres, to indicate both Ceres and Proserpina, Quirini, to indicate both Romulus and Remus. In this case, the name of the strong member of the pair is pluralized and swallows the name of the other member. Moving up the divine hierarchy, there are also eunones alongside euno. In Roman society, each woman, in fact, had her own euno. To Pliny the Elder, this explains why, and this quotation, the population of the gods is bigger even than that of humans, since individuals make of themselves so many gods, adopting their own eunones and genii. And what about the Veneres of Catullus? At this point, the question becomes more intriguing. The Veneres, they are not only invited to mourn the sparrow's death together with Cupidines. You have quotations in point 6 of your handout, in the famous Lugeto Veneres Cupidinesque. But the Veneres even gift Lesbia a precious perfume, and above all function as representation of the supreme beauty of the beloved, she who has robbed the Venuses, surrupit Veneres, from all other women. In this respect, it is opportune to add that Plautus had already made one of his characters, a slave bearing good news to his mistresses, say, Amenitates omnium Venerum et Venustatum adquero. I bring the joy of all the Venuses and all the Graces. If the Catullian and Plotin Veneres did not trouble the convictions of the ancient guardians of language, as the Latin grammarians have been successfully named by Bob Castor, nevertheless, they have piqued the curiosity of modern scholars, as it was easily predictable. As you can imagine, many commentators tried very hard to explain Catullus's Veneres, but the results have turned out poorly. We will limit ourselves to the explanations offered by some of the most credited scholars. So Fordyce, following Schulze, following Ellis and Merrill, among others, argue that the plural Veneres is an extravagance of the poet, offering a metrical opportunity to create a parallel with Cupidines. I observe, however, how Quintilian, an author hardly inclined to extravagance and also writing in prose, also uses the form Veneres without any parallelism. Fordyce suggested another possibility. The plural of Venus could be an allusion, an allusion to the many Aphrodites recognized by Alexandrian mythology, with a reference to Callimachus, Iambe, 10th B. Pfeiffer. Actually, the Greek poet Callimachus refers to the many Aphrodites worshipped in Greek cult. Wilhelm Kohl already considered this reference to Gelehrte, to learned. Certainly, it is unlikely that Plautus, when he also uses Veneres in plural, was in any way alluding to Callimachus. Robinson Ellis, the English philologist of the 19th century, whose commentary on Catullus is still considered one of the best, is the most interesting. Confronted with the poet's Veneres Cupidinesque, Ellis cites a passage of Cicero's De Natura Deorum, where 4 Venuses and 3 Cupids are catalogued. Ellis concludes that, at least from this point of view, the poet was speaking with strict accuracy. But that was important for an English philologist of the 19th century, with strict accuracy. However, Ellis then goes on to consider the verse in which Catullus talks about Lesbia's vow to Sanctae Veneri Cupidinique, to Holy Venus and Cupid. This is point 7. Namely, to toss the writing of Volusius in the fire if Catullus returns to her. This time, the same pair of gods is evoked in the singular, not the plural, as Plautus himself also does in other contexts. According to Ellis, this must mean that Catullus merely pluralized this without any special reference to the various forms of the goddess of or her son. If the same author, in the same type of context, cites the same gods in the plural as well as in the singular, this means that number makes no difference to him. Ellis's elementary conclusion, Catullus merely pluralizes the name of the goddess, invites a question, however. What did Catullus and before him Plautus have in mind when they pluralized Venus? I too discard the possibility that these authors were thinking of the several Venuses produced by theological speculation, since a comic playwright and a love poet hardly thought about such things. Yet, there we must still consider the several Venuses of the public cult. In other words, given that in Roman society Venus was revered in different forms and with different epithets, a Roman could imagine not only the existence of one Venus, but of several Venuses, similar to the many Madonnas of Lourdes, of Pompeii, of the Pilar, and so on, of Catholic cult. But do we really believe that Catullus, at the moment of mourning his beloved passer, of praising her perfume, of representing her incomparable Venustas, was talking about Venuses and not of Venus, because he had in mind Venus Ericina, Venus Felix, Venus Victrix, or Venus Genetrix? If it is unlikely that a love poet or a comic playwright were thinking of the Venuses of theological speculation, it is equally unlikely that they had in mind those of the city cults. We should resign ourselves to that, to the idea that, and this is in point 8 of your handout, the idea that Plautus and Catullus pluralized Venus for the same reason Horace pluralized Vertumnus, and the Romans in general could pluralize Juno, the Lar, or Silvanus, or create Castores, or create Quirini, because the name of Roman gods, in certain cases, exceeds the boundaries of grammatical number. If we wanted to replace the obviously unfounded rule of the grammarians with one more respectful of Latin linguistic and Roman cultural usage, we could say instead, with respect to divine names, the linguistic category of number in certain cases is not considered at all relevant. Take another example. As we know, the Romans referred to the dead as a group as dimanes. They were called dimanes. But what is striking is that this expression was used to indicate a deceased individual as well. In funeral dedications, we find numerous formulae like Evodiae dis manibus nepotis sui, dis manibus sacrum Luci Caecili Rufi, where the expression dimanes follows the name of a single person in the genitive case, to the dimanes of Evodia or of her nephew, of Lucius Caecilius Rufus, and so on and so on. This is point 9. In literary text, too, we often encounter the dimanes of a single person, probably These expressions have become so familiar to us that we are no longer able to perceive how odd it is to designate a single individual in the plural. Why should Lucius Caecilius Rufus, upon death, suddenly become many? For what reason does Seneca's Andromache invoke the Deus manes of her husband, as in point 9, as if he were no longer just one actor? That's strange. Not to mention when Anchises, in the 6th book of the Aeneid, utters one of the most puzzling phrases of the poem, the famous quisque suos patimur manes. Each one suffers his own manes, probably to indicate the suffering of the deceased as such in the Hades. This is point 10. Virgilian commentators have always underlined the singularity of the pronoun quisque, each one, agreeing with the first person plural of patimur, quisque patimur. Rightly so, it is surprising, but is it not equally curious that each individual, that person in the Hades, suffers the plural version of himself, his own manes? In the case of the D manes, in short, the conclusion must be the same that we drew above. In the field of divinity, the linguistic category of number can be irrelevant, it's oscillating. The indifference to grammatical number of the divinity has an interesting parallel. Also, gender appears sometimes irrelevant. Many gods in Rome have both a masculine and a feminine form, as in couples like Faunus, Fauna, Liber, Libera, Limentinus, Limentina, Volumnus, Volumna, and so on and so forth. They are the specular couples of gods who once attracted the attention of Hermann Usener. These are gods whose natural gender was apparently not considered significant, for which reason their linguistic designation shifts between masculine and feminine. But there is more, point 11. Citing a Clypeus consecrated on the Capitoline Hill, Servius reports its inscription, Genio urbis Romae, sive mas, sive femina, to the genius of the city of Rome, whether male or female. As far as the genius of the city of Rome was concerned, gender, male or female, was not considered relevant. It goes without saying, on the other hand, that in the sphere of mythological tales, the divinity does not hesitate to take on both male and female aspects. From a linguistic point of view, however, the most interesting case is offered by the fact that, this is point 12, in Latin, it was possible to use the masculine substantive deus to designate also a female goddess. If Minerva is the deus who invented the oil, as in the Georgical Virgin, the deus who invented the oil, it is again a feminine deus, Venus, who guides Aeneas out of the burning Troia in the Aeneid. There are other cases in which Latin uses a masculine noun to indicate both the male and the female subject indifferently, and this is in point 13. And what is interesting, this occurs in context and with specific semantic purposes, which closely recalled the use of the simple deus to designate divinities of both genders. For example, we know how poor could also designate a puella. You could say, in archaic Latin, poor to be puella. Or socrus could be used for both father-in-law and mother-in-law. Originally, socrus indicated only the mother-in-law. Then the term was extended to cover also the father-in-law. And again, heres for both male and female heir. More interestingly, parents, properly mother, woman who gives birth, parit, parents, could be used for both mother and father. It is a linguistic strategy used in order to neutralize the distinction between natural genders. In other words, this morphological expedient intends to highlight that the determining quality in these subjects is constituted not by the gender, but from time to time by the age group to which they belong, as puer for puella, so just the age group that is marked, by their family or parental function, parents and socrus. It is not important to designate the gender. They are just parents. They are just parents-in-law. By their legal position, heirs, heir, regardless of whether they are male or female. Even in the case of deus, used to indicate both male and female divinities, therefore, we must conclude that when the Romans speak of the gods, the grammatical gender is neutralized in favor of the characteristic of being divine in general, regardless of whether this quality is exercised by a male or female divinity. Speaking of gender in the field of the divine, it is difficult not to think of Numen. Id est, a neutral noun used in Latin to designate divinity. In the past, a certain school of thought has led some scholars to believe that Numen constituted the most archaic, indeed the most primitive representation of the notion of the divine in Rome, equivalent to the to the mana recovered by the old anthropologists among the population of Melanesia. It is useless to dwell on this topic today. Fortunately, it is over. Let us rather consider the kind of attention paid by philologists and historians of religion on the etymology of Numen. They have traditionally concentrated on its root, its relationship with nuo, to move the head, to do so, in the sense of expressing one will, and not on the morphological features of the noun. Yet in this case, the nature of the suffix can communicate information as interesting as that provided by the root. But let's start from a more general point of view, by saying how remarkable it is to designate a divinity with a neutral noun. It means representing the divine regardless of gender determination. In this case, gender marks are neutralized at the source, if I may say so, because it's a neutral. Let's go deeper. What is the general functioning of the neuter in Indo-European languages? And this is in point 14. As the Italian linguist Romano Lazzeroni, who was once my professor of historical linguistics in Italy, effectively summarized, the neutral is, quotation, characterized by a variable participation in a set of traits ranging from non-individuality to non-countability. Such a variable participation in the traits of non-individuality and non-countability explains the collective value of the Indo-European neutral. In other words, in the category of the neutral, absence of countability and lack of individuality can be combined in varying proportions. Also in Numen, the most relevant characters are constituted by non-countability and non-individuality, and this is further confirmed by the specific nature of the suffix used to form this noun, the Latin suffix "man." And now I apologize for being a bit more detailed and more morphologically oriented, but I hope that by the end of this short analysis, you will forgive me. So this is point 15 in your handout. Latin has, in fact, many other terms in man, and they are agmen, fragmen, germen, gramen, sagmen, semen, stamen, stramen, tegimen or tegmen, subtemen, vimen, and so on. It sounds like a rap. It is a class of neutral nouns derived from verbs, always derived from verbs, and often in a collective nature, as they designate mostly a set of parts. This is the point. They designate normally a set of parts. Agmen is a set of soldiers, or ants, as in Virgil, as you certainly remember, on the march. Gramen, a set of grass, primarily intended for animal pasture. Semen, a set of seeds. Stramen, a set of straw for the straw mat. Tegmen, a set of materials with which a cover is made. Germen, everything germinating from a plant. Women means fibers of rush or willow used as a tie, and so on. Note that in each of these cases, we are dealing with a set of parts whose countability is not considered relevant. Doesn't matter to specify of how many straws the stramen is made up, or of how many soldiers a marching agmen is made up. What matters is the whole, is the mass. The lack of prominence attributed to countability in this class of neutral nouns appears confirmed by the fact that, and this is point 15, in many cases, it is also possible to use substantives in the plural, agmina, gramina, semina, stramina, wimina, with the same identical meaning. Since we are dealing with collectives, it has nouns designating a set which is already plural in itself. The linguistic category of number is neutralized. What we have said about agmen, stramen, gramen, and so on, and other substantives belonging to the class of nouns in men, applies to the same title for numen. Also in this case, we are faced with a collective noun characterized by the same indifference towards countability. A simple look at the uses of numen, this is point 16, allows us to see how it can be used both in the singular and in the plural, numen or numina, with the same meaning as the other terms in men. So you can use numen or numina just to mean God, divinity, it's the same. In addition, and this is probably even more interesting, numen in the singular can be used in reference to a plurality of gods. Numina in the plural can be used in reference to a single deity. By defining the characters of divinity through a noun such as numen, the traits of countability and of individuality become irrelevant. Because if you can say numen to mean a plurality of gods, or numina to mean just one god, it means that the countability is not relevant at all. The numen, like the stramen, the agmen, and so forth, the numen is a whole, is a bundle of divine characteristics, not better specified, and above all, not better identified. What conclusion can we draw from our reflection? The term numen defines the divine regardless of both its masculine, feminine characteristic, because it is a neutral noun, and regardless of its singular plural nature, since it falls within a class of nouns in which the countability feature is irrelevant. In other words, the use of numen fully corresponds to what we have already seen above in cases where the same divinity is indicated either as indifferent to gender, Silvanus, Silvana, genius of Rome, male or female, Deus, to indicate both God and goddess, or as indifferent to number, Laren, Lares, Vertunus, Vertuni, Venus, Veneris, and so forth. This means that numen does not represent at all the most archaic or worse primitive manifestation of divinity in Rome, but constitutes a fully complete expression of the way in which, in general, the divine is conceived and represented in Roman culture. The linguistic marks from which the Numen is distinguished, irrelevance of number, irrelevance of gender, in the Latin system correspond synchronously to those used to define divinity, even with other designation. Now, point 17 in your handout. An ancient god, as Jean-Pierre Vernant wrote, expresses the aspects of and the modes of action of a power, not of a personal form of existence. Ancient gods are not persons, personnes, but powers, puissance. The sentence of Vernant echoes Paul Venn's words quoted above, pointing out how the experience of the divine encounters a force, not an individuality. So the non-personal path indicated by Venn and Vernant to cross the territory of the ancient polytheism turns out to be the one to follow also in our specific case. The linguistic representation of the Roman divinity does not at all suggest the idea that it was perceived in personal terms, in the way in which we understand this expression. Because certainly an entity whose designations, as we have seen, oscillate between singular and plural, between masculine and feminine, or neutralized to genders, as in Numen, can hardly be defined as a person. Grammatical number and gender hardly apply to an entity that is not fully personal. Consequently, the virtumni evoked by Davus, the veneres of Plotus and Catullus, the manes, the dimanes of a single individual, the numen designating a plurality of gods, and the numina covering just one god, simply confront us with a feature of ancient divinity that our own cultural categories struggle to capture, its non-personal character, its non-personal character. The fact that, speaking of Roman gods, gender and number enter into language in such oscillating and almost counterintuitive terms, as in the case of veneres or virtumni, suggests that this particular grammatical treatment of divinity represents an attempt to convey the exceptional nature of divinity. It's being radically different from humanity. It's not sharing the fundamental characteristics of a human person, being either one or many, male or female. Exceeding the limits of life, since they are immortal, exceeding the limits of space, since they are everywhere, the gods also exceed the limits imposed by language. Making the gods defy linguistic rules is part of the same strategy pursued by creating mythological tales where the gods accomplish supernatural actions, by enacting solemn and scrupulous ceremonies removed from the experience of everyday life, by drawing the inviolable perimeter of the sacred, excluding the profanes from touching and even seeing it. The difficult task of culturally constructing divinity is carried out by combining a set of traits able to exceed and even contradict what is human. Facing the necessity of representing the divine by using human means, this is the problem, representing the divine by using human means, the ancient culture enacted a similar strategy by exceeding the limits in other areas different from language as well. In this respect, we could take a Greek example relating not to the linguistic representation of divinity, but to its iconographic representation, namely the famous statue of Zeus at Olympia by Phidias, which, according to Strabo, was so large that if it had stood up from its throne, it would have destroyed the roof of the temple. It was so big and so high that, okay. And the Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Pucci observes, if we take an emic point of view, a point of view internal to the culture, we understand that Zeus, the Zeus of Olympia, was not defective. Its intentionally out of scale size was meant to express in the form of a statue a divinity which manifests itself to mortal. When we are dealing with representations of the divine, presumed irregularities of grammar go hand in hand with also presumed disproportionalities of art. But let's not escape from language. Through the particularities that we have tried to highlight, Latin can open us, Latin language, can open us a precious glimpse into one of the most fascinating features of ancient polytheism. In this religious system, divinities are not only many because they form a pantheon populated by many gods, but because each of them is first of all multiple. Such a characteristic in the sphere of religious practices and beliefs manifests itself also through the plurality of epithets attributed to the same divinity, through the multiplicity of forms of worship dedicated to it, through the diversity of the spheres over which each god or goddess presides by exercising their own specific modes of action. At the level of linguistic representation, intrinsic plurality of the ancient gods manifests itself in the first place through the possibility of attributing both singular and plural numbers to them, multiplying their presence, but also by making them mutable, by attributing to them male gender in some cases, female gender in others, or by neutralizing this opposition. What we have said so far, however, does not at all intend to deny that the Roman gods, as well as the Greek ones, could also possess features bringing them closer to our idea of person. Starting with the language, which, while on the one hand does not respect either gender or number when it comes to divinities, on the other hand, give them proper names, as we do with, as they did with humans, uses forms of personal address towards the gods, and so on. In the same way, mythological tales turn deities into real characters of the story, depicting them as interpreters of narrative or dramatic sequences expressing specific personalities, inclinations, and behaviors like persons. Just as there is no doubt that the iconographic tradition attributes to them often unmistakable and individual features. Behind this inclination to the personal construction of divinities lies a profound motivation already perfectly described by Cicero Scotta in De Natura Deorum, and this is point 18. And Scotta says, if poets, painters, and artists have attributed human form to divinity, he said, this has happened because it was not easy to represent in another form the gods who acted and worked, agentes et molientes. Cicero, therefore, established, or Scotta, established a close link between the agency of divinities, that is, their ability to actively intervene in human and natural processes, and their representation in personal form. If we believe we are surrounded by agentes et molientes entities, entities with which we interact and interact with us, we inevitably end up attributing to those forces the form that agents normally have, that's human form. It is precisely the aspects of divinities inspired by personifying them, the personalized side of gods, opposed to their personal side, that can account for the curious insistence of Latin grammarians in denying the possibility of pluralizing the names of the gods. The human-like aspects of divinity we just listed above invited the grammarians to humanize the gods also concerning the morphology of their names. They were grammarians, and grammarians seek uniformity. In other words, if there is a Venus identified as an ancestor of the Yuli, as the heroine of the Aeneid, and as easily recognizable through her own iconographic attributes, such a personal individuality of the goddess will invite to discipline her name in a consistent, personal, and individual way, unless denied, as we have seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maurizio. I'm just kind of processing. That was so, I feel like you have turned my understanding inside out. Do you know what I mean? Because the thing that would seem strange and aberrant to me now suddenly becomes the core sense, you know, what actually is happening with representations of the gods. Whereas the world I inhabit, which is just literary texts, becomes a kind of one narrow version of the story. Does that seem true? You may be muted, but in any case, thank you. I mean, it's just, yeah, that's my question to start, let me say then. Okay, so may I ask also,
can you repeat the question, because I couldn't hear it before.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It wasn't even really a question. I was just reflecting on the fact that from my perspective, you have turned my perspective upside down, because I'm used to thinking about the literary representations of the gods where I spend my time as the representation of the gods, with these strange things being kind of marginal or, you know, beyond my ken. I have to confess, I'm teaching Catullus this semester, and I blitzed right past when our encyclopedia makes way without, you know, saying a word about it. So I'm sort of sitting here adjusting my mind frame on the Roman gods. So thank you for that.
Okay,
that's just,
great.
you know, I wanted to open it up to some questions, and I see there are some questions in the Q&A. Okay, so here is one. Could a parallel argument be made that the singular ho theos in Greek, as encountered in Plato and Herodotus, is similarly fluid, so that it does not necessarily express a monotheistic belief, as we might instinctively expect by the singular use of the term, but a belief in a transcendent divinity which transcends the rigid concepts of singular and plural? Yeah. Could you hear that one, Maurizio?
Not perfectly.
I'm so sorry. I wonder what's up with my sound.
If I understand, there is something similar in Greek culture. This is what the
question was about ho theos. If we could think of that not as sort of monotheism, but incipient monotheism, but a kind of similar disregard or fudging of the singular plural.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. There are similar phenomena also in Greek religion. And I think that just monotheism used us to think of just one God, and also to think the God in personal terms, because the God of monotheism really became a person. Jesus Christ was a human, was a man. So there was a real transit through humanity of God. So for us, it's easy to think the God is a person, but not for the ancient polytheistic religions, in which think worked much differently. But for sure, I mean, Greek perception of the God was much closer to the Roman one. Yeah, sure.
Great. And here is another that's coming up. Would you care to speculate why the noun Venus jumped gender? Presumably the noun started its life as a neuter noun of the same type as genus, generis. The movement of gender away from the neuter seems in general to be in the opposite direction from what you argue. Because from the neuter to the feminine, this person is asking.
Yeah, could work at both ways.
Yeah.
This is why. So Venus at the beginning was just a neutral, a substantive, meaning a sort of force, of divine force, able to fascinate or, you know, to charm or whatever. Like in, for example, venenum is the same word. I mean, it's derived from Venus, the Venus, I mean, the neutral. And then it became genderized because of this personal tendency to create, to personalize gods. But at the same time, there is also the other direction, to depersonalize the gods. So it goes both ways, in a sense. Numen is the most depersonalized representation of the god, because there are no iconographic representation of the Numen. There are no mythological tale in which Numen does something as a character. So this is the extreme on one side. On the other side, there is the most personalized characters like Jupiter and so it's well, polytheism is a bit confused, but there are rules inside that work.
That's great. Here is another question. Is this phenomenon of Roman gods being uncountable related or not to the royal we in English and other languages, or does that have a completely different explanation? The royal we, yeah. Is this a phenomenon you're familiar with in English, the so-called royal we?
What is the royal we?
The royal we is a kind of it's a use of the plural for a singular yes. It's you know, and my students often want to know in Latin, because there's plenty of sort of what I call poetic plural we's, which are not apparently the royal we. But I think the point is that fluctuation of number for a figure of authority.
Well, actually, yeah, it's a phenomenon that starts in Latin too, very late, in the 3rd, 4th century BC, for the emperor to use the nos and to be addressed as the vos. But I learned through the American fiction, so I'm not sure what I'm going to say. But there are queer persons that want to be addressed as plural and then speak of themselves as plural. So this is another interesting phenomenon. So the pluralization of an individuality. Yeah. But going back to the ancient word, I think it's interesting that persona in Latin doesn't mean what we mean with person. Persona is for the Romans a mask that you wear or the role that you exert in society. And so you can have many personae. And as the scholars of Roman law says, in Rome, you have a persona. You are not a persona. So the persona, meaning individual, starts only very late after the discussion about the person of Christ. And so it's a concept that persona, as we intend, person, that they didn't have. So this is another disconcerting fact to capture the rules of ancient polytheism.
Okay, I'm going to give you one more, I think, which is, can the Arnobius excerpt point to on the handout, so Arnobius on your handout, can that be read to suggest that this grammatical rule, no plural divine names, applies to all proper names, not just to the names of gods? That is, proper names should logically be singular because they refer to individuals, whether human or divine. Can you further elaborate on why Latin grammarians would have been motivated to police the tendency to pluralize specifically divine names? Did that come through?
Yeah. Well, yeah, sort of, yeah. I think because it was possible to have plural of proper names of person because of the gentes. So the Emilii existed, the Scipiones existed. So for them, it was normal to have a proper name that was plural because of the gentilicia, but not for the flumina, not for the mountains, not for the gods. So I think that they concentrated on the gods and on the other heroes and the other elements, and not on the persons, because for the person, paradoxically, it was possible to have plural of proper names.
Partly, yes, again, because people are bounded, therefore they can be plural. I mean, in a way, it's that very boundedness that
Exactly.
and just replicate. Okay, well, there are more. Maybe I'll give you one more. That's okay, because the questions are still rolling in. Are you okay? So your description of the unmarked, linguistically unmarked, unrepresented divine corresponds well with what, this is a comment, not a question, corresponds well with what Herodotus 253 says about how Homer and Hesiod in effect created Greek gods as we know them. Yes, that seems
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
With a slight difference with respect to Roman culture, if I can add something. For Herodotus, there were the poets that gave shape to the gods. And Warrow says that he will speaking about the res humanae and res divinae, antiquitates humanae, antiquitates divinae. He will speak before of the antiquitates humanae and then of the antiquitates divinae, because they are the civitates that institute the res divinae, the gods. So in Rome, there is this civic perception of the control of the man over the god. For the Greeks, they are the poets. It is poetry that gave shape to the gods. I think it's a different angle. It's interesting. But absolutely, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. I keep meaning to stop, and I keep seeing these interesting questions popping up. So I promise this is my very last. This is the last. So, given the multiplicity of agricultural gods and gods for every developmental step in a baby's life, and so on in Roman culture, about which I know you have thought a great deal, in fact, can this idea of the plural god be more specifically a Latin Roman issue and different from the situation in Greek culture? Well, so I guess, yeah, I think this is what you've been. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. I think yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the gods are infinite, as in Rome, as Warren says. And so the Flamen or the Pontifex was already worried about forgetting about some god. That was the main worry of a Pontifex, because there were too many.
Yes. So, yeah. So is it true, this is just, so that in Rome, every woman could have her own Juno, but in Greece, women didn't have their own Hera, I take it. They did not have
yes, exactly. Okay, so I don't think so. In Rome, that was possible. Each woman had a Juno, a specific Juno.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. It's just completely fascinating to think about. It really is. I'm so grateful. It's so lovely to have you back. Even just this way, it's so lovely. And we're going to have you back for real sometime as soon as such a thing can be managed. We have to.
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
It will be a great pleasure to be back.
Yes, well, yeah. So let me just thank Maurizio for a really fascinating and thought-provoking lecture, and the audience, our invisible audience out there, for coming. And let me just mention finally that our last Sather lecture is coming up on April 3rd, and you'll find all the information about it. The registration link might show up in the chat now, it might not, but it's super easy to find. That's Mary Margaret McCabe talking to us about Plato, so more mind-bending speculation coming your way. So thank you so much, Maurizio. Thank you so much, audience.
Thank you, you all.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.